panel that we've got today is focused on AI openness in the age of DeepSeek R1. It's exploring the transformative potential of AI openness, both the challenges and the risks, and how these sit alongside the innovation and business opportunities within the UK. We've got a fabulous panel who will be joining us, and the person who will be chairing is Amanda Brock. Amanda is the CEO of Open UK. She is a lawyer with a background in internet law and has shaped Open Source's legal framework. And at present, she is the advisor to the UK Cabinet Office on Open Standards and the UKRI Digital Research Infrastructure, as well as on a number of commercial boards. I would like to hand over to Amanda to introduce her panel, and here they come. Amanda. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, and well done for getting upstairs quickly. I know the building isn't the easiest to navigate. So you have us for the first 40 minutes this morning, and we are going to talk to you about AI openness. Now, I say we, and currently you've only got me. There should be 4 people joining us. One is slightly delayed and may join us through the process of the panel session. But for now, I would like to invite Sonia Cooper, who is AGC of Open Innovation at Microsoft, Dr. Laura Gilbert, formerly of Number 10, now of the Ellis Institute, and AI founder Alex Housley of Selden to join me on stage. So as I say, we're hoping that Aarushi will come and join us through the course of the panel. And our speakers this morning are deep experts in openness. But before we get to them, and before we get to the conversation about openness and AI and what it means and how it impacts the UK and impacts our daily lives and our different roles, I'd just like to contextualize things a little bit. And you may have noticed that we haven't called this open source. Now, open source is something very specific and has a 30-year established definition when it comes to software. And key to that definition is 10 requirements that the licenses meet. But at 5 and 6, it says that anyone can use the code for any purpose. Now, when we apply this concept of openness, of open source to AI, we get into a slightly more controversial area. Because for it to really meet that traditional definition of open source, anybody has to use the code for any purpose. And that's not really what we see day to day when we talk about openness and AI. We often see that open source standard, that free flow that's enabled the mass adoption of open source software not being met. But that doesn't mean that the AI that's shared without meeting that standard isn't also open. So in our panel today, we're going to explore openness as it's gone in the last 2 years to get us to the point of DeepSeek R1 in January. I may well have this printed on the back of a T-shirt, but Sam Altman on the 30th of January on Reddit said that he thought OpenAI was on the wrong side of history because it hadn't opened up its weights. And he did then go on to say that's a personal view. It wasn't something that was a priority for OpenAI. But I think the impact of DeepSeek R1 has been absolutely critical. Now, we're just about celebrating the 2-year anniversary of all of this. And 2 years ago, we saw we saw OpenAI release ChatGPT 4. And that ChatGPT 4 point in March 2023 really saw a shift. And the shift that we saw was in the pace of innovation and the pace of adoption. And as you fast forward across those 2 years to get to January this year and DeepSeek releasing R1, what we see is the leak of the first Llama LLM, where suddenly there was competition in the marketplace, which shouldn't be called open source because it was leaked software that had been shared only for use by academics, suddenly was in the open market. And what happened was the pace of innovation around that software was so fast that the big techs couldn't compete. It was unprecedented. And by May of 2023, you see Google talking about, or a member of Google's team in a leaked memo talking about having no protection from the IP needed, no IP protection it could rely on that would enable it to differentiate its product from the open products. Fast forward to July 23, and you see Open UK supporting the launch of Llama 2, even although it's not on a traditional open source license. It's very much AI openness and not open source, because it has a restriction on 7 million users. If you hit 7 million users on any derivative work you create, you have to go back to getting a license from Meta. And then we see, as you move on, the start of this year, DeepSeek R1, I think it's 20% of the cost of past LLMs. I believe that it was created from distillation of Llama. So if Llama hadn't been out there in the open, we wouldn't have R1. And this is the piece that's at the essence of openness, the ability to recycle, to reuse, to build, to create more innovation. R1 went into the market, and within days, Hugging Face in France were building on top of R1 to build a truly open version of it. And then we see them, 2 weeks ago, I think, with Open Source Week. And each day a repository was released by DeepSeek that was entirely open, providing tooling. So we've got the open weight in R1, we've got other open source software around R1, and we've got a set of really detailed instructions. So I'm not going to talk much about me. I'm not going to talk much about Open UK. We're the industry organisation for openness in the UK, software, hardware, data, standards and AI. And we also do a lot of advocacy. You'll see on our website, openuk.uk/reports, you'll find a report from the Action Summit that I was at that brings you all the detail on what I've just given you on the conversation in the last 2 years on openness. And what I want to do now is go over to the panel and give each of them 3 minutes to start to talk about how this has impacted them. And we were going to go to Aarushi first to talk about the engineering perspective. She is an engineering leader at AutoGPT. And for anyone who doesn't know, AutoGPT is agentic technology that was built on the top of ChatGPT-4. It was built by Tor and Bruce Richards in Edinburgh. And until R1, and it may still be, but until R1 at least, I can be sure, it was the fastest growing open source repository in the world on a true open source license. And it was something that was enabling others to build on top of it. So it's quite incredible, the success that this UK-based product's had. Now, if Aarushi is able to get here, we'll get her to talk a bit about the engineering. But Alex, I'm going to come over to you next and get you to introduce yourself and just talk a bit about having run a business in the UK for 10 years, built on top of open AI.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here today. So, I'm Alex Housley, founder of Selden. Founded Selden in 2014. Prior to that, built and scaled a recommendation engine, which was closed source. The focus for that business was like media, newspapers, etc. And one of the challenges was overnight switching on a new publication, which may have tens of millions of readers. So we kind of saw firsthand the challenges of scaling infrastructure for just one very specific use case, the recommendation engine. And what we started to see in here is that organizations were showing a lot more interest in solving much broader range of use cases with machine learning more generally, so using classifications, regressions, etc., not just a recommendation. And so really the same kind of infrastructure can support many different use cases, many different types of models and frameworks. And so really that was kind of the inspiration for building Selden in the first place. And actually a lot of the technology that we had been kind of leveraging within our own platform was open source as well. Back then, there wasn't as strong of a open source ecosystem around AI. Certainly not on the infrastructure level. At that time, it was more on the data science tooling and data side of things, but there was very little on the infrastructure, on the deployment and serving, scaling of models in production, and actually that turned out to be a much harder problem than what people anticipated. So it was good timing, I think, for for the launch of Selden, for the first product development, and the release of Kubernetes. So a lot of our early traction came from leveraging the Kubernetes platform for orchestrating and scaling applications, but then building on top of that to enable the scaling of machine learning models. And
Alex, I'm just going to... Yeah. Do you know what Kubernetes is? Because I think we've got an AI crowd. Does everybody know what Kubernetes is? If you don't, put your hands up. Okay. Do you want to do a quick or will I?
Yeah, just a brief. Applications went from being packaged as a virtual machine to deploy in the cloud. And then Docker came along and sort of stripped away a lot of the kind of bloat that's required to package the operating system with the rest of the code. And these containers make it very easy to sort of package and distribute software. And as you know, complex software requires a full architecture for the application to run as a whole. And what Kubernetes does is provide all of the plumbing that enables these sort of containers to work well together and scale effectively. So, you can point your, you can create a cluster in a data center or in the cloud and have your Kubernetes-powered application leverage that and scale up. And so if you apply the same concept for machine learning models, as more requests come in for, say, your fraud detection model, it can then start building replicas and scale up within the data center.
I think it's fair to say that Kubernetes is public cloud software in the main, and probably it's true open source software, probably underlying most public clouds that we see in the hyperscalers.
Yeah, actually, I think it was originally a Google technology. I think it was their Google Borg project, and this is what they used internally to manage their data centers and their infrastructure, and then now it's been adopted across all the clouds and has become a standard.
And on this, as an entrepreneur, this openness, how do we see you making money around this?
So in the early days, it was very much about distribution, and especially being first to market, or one of the first to market with a new technology in a new category. It's a great way of kind of setting a standard, and sort of, the concept was effectively, if people have our software installed, especially in an enterprise setting, then there's a strategic advantage to that we can build upon. Then over time, of course, new entrants, new market entrants emerge. Of course, all of the major tech companies have developed their own AI platforms, AI solutions. So there is kind of a race to then, on a feature level, compete. And but what we found, though, is that the open core technologies have received quite a lot of kind of contribution and feedback from the wider user base, which did help us to refine the product and then build out the next generation of our platform, focusing on kind of like model serving for complex and real-time AI use cases, leveraging sort of data streaming technologies for that. Kafka is the case, is the software we're using there. But one of the big challenges, though, with open source is companies can freely use your software, and if enough of the value is contained within the open source component, then really there's no obligation for them to pay you. And I think from a startup perspective, your mission is to ultimately grow into a sustainable, fast growth revenue business. Whereas as a large enterprise, often your motivation is to create some software which can be commoditized, so you're not tying up your internal teams in maintaining and building it, and you can all share access to this this resource over time. So there is a kind of I'd say a tightrope or a thin line to tread around how much you put into the open source, and too much can be damaging, but too little, can also impact the adoption of the core technology.
And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. I think for anybody who's from an open source background, commercialization of open source is often considered to be the holy grail. It's the hardest piece of the picture. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But this idea or concept of open core, where the central piece is open and then there's closed pieces around it, sorry, that are used to help you build a sustainable revenue is very common. So I'm going to come next to Laura. Laura, can you introduce yourself to us a little bit about your experience around the open space, particularly in government?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. I've recently changed jobs, so I'm now the head of the AI for Government programme, which is run jointly by the Ellison Institute and the Tony Blair Institute. I also still do a day a week advising the Department of Science, Tech and Innovation. But for the sort of 4.5 years before that, I was the Director of Data Science in Downing Street. And part of that was building up the incubator for artificial intelligence, which you may have seen in the press a little bit. I think they've recently announced Humphrey, a suite of sort of largely open source tools to make the civil service more efficient. There's also a lot of work that goes into improving the delivery of frontline services with AI. And it's very human-centric, so the tagline is to try and make government more human using artificial intelligence. We've gone for we've on open source very early in that journey. In fact, right at the start. When I announced that we were going to build this team, we said we were going to operate with radical transparency. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is sort of ethos, really. We do believe in open source. A part of it is also public trust, and ensuring that really we can't make mistakes. Because if a team like this, it's very unusual in government to have a team that's more than 90% engineers, with very strong technical backgrounds, but they're building code that will go into public service delivery. And the first thing that happened, of course, when this was announced, is that people went onto Twitter and they either said, well, government's going to do this very badly, they're not competent, or they said, oh, we think that you're going to use this to do things that we don't like, take away our benefits, for example. So it was very, very important for us to show and tell exactly what we were doing. You can go and look at the code base, and if we're doing work in asylum, it is definitely to get people to safer, better accommodation faster, and it's not to replace humans making asylum decisions. So the idea of putting the code out there and showing people what you're doing becomes very important if you want to build a trusting relationship with the public. It's not completely trivial, however. One of the first things that happened when we open sourced Redbox was a corporation picked up the open source, repackaged it, sold it back into government. And I was a little upset because we'd open sourced it sort of for transparency, etc. And we were happy for people to use it, but we definitely built it for government to be used for free. And obviously we hadn't done a good enough job of advertising that it was sat right there. So sort of seeing a company reselling it, saying, this is number 10 certified code that we will now sell back to you, was really uncomfortable. So we've then had a little bit of a thought process that's still going on now, which looks like, is it actually right to open source code that's built by government to anyone when the taxpayer pays for it? And should we in fact be commercializing that code so that perhaps if you're in the public sector, it's free, but if you're not, or perhaps if you're a company based in another country, for example, should you actually be paying the taxpayer back? So some of the code will definitely remain open source, but we're definitely also thinking about a model now where the code is in the open, but there are sort of license conditions attached to that. And it's going to be interesting to see where sort of the internal AI community lands on that, because there's two very different camps, and one of them is really we should be deriving value for the taxpayer. This is a reasonable thing to do, and we should put some terms and conditions on how the code's used. Is it really for the public good? And then there's another camp that says, well, it's very expensive to maintain, both the code and the licensing conditions and the business and contractual negotiations that you need to go in. That the sort of industry that goes around supporting commercial code is very different than what it is at the moment, which essentially is just putting it on GitHub. So it's a live debate, and I've not even decided myself where I think we should end up. But it will be interesting to see that. What I think will carry on is that the code will be at least inspectable. So sort of respecting principles of sort of transparency and accountability and auditability and all those sorts of things. And we really do want the public, or particularly the skilled public, to go and look at that. And on the hopefully incredibly unlikely off chance we've done something wrong, tell us very, very quickly. We really do need that engagement. If a team like this in government was to do something that was objectively, led to a bad outcome, I don't think government would carry on hiring lots of technologists and doing it themselves. So, while you're in the room, if you get a little bit bored on your commute home, ai.gov.uk points to some of the early repositories that are sort of coming out fairly regularly. Go and have a poke around and see if we can do it better. Hopefully not. But, if you think we can, now's the time.
I'm going to say hopefully you can do it better. And what you can do is, because it is actually open source, you can contribute. And you can add your contributions and allow the ecosystem to grow and build. There's a thing called Linus's Law from open source software, and it's like many eyes make bugs shallow. And the more people who see this code and the more who contribute to it, in my view at least, the better. The big question I think you have isn't so much about open source as about your suppliers and your supply chain and how they're vetted. Because what open source and opening up the code ought to do, or opening up the AI ought to do, is build trust. And it ought to do that through transparency. I suspect you might not have had the same issue if it hadn't been open source, but because it was open source, you were able to see what the problem was.
Yeah, the trust point is very interesting. Trust in government is quite far below trust in advertisers and marketers. So people will believe, their Facebook adverts for clothing before they believe government. And you can't fix that by saying to people, but we're trustworthy. That's not the way it works. You actually have to prove it.
Yeah,
so we're hoping by being trustworthy, people will start to believe that we are.
And I'm going to come over to Sonia next to introduce yourself. One of the big challenges that we've seen across AI as it's evolved isn't so much that the AI itself has opened up, and increasingly we're seeing, the quote I gave you from Sam Altman about being on the wrong side of history. We're increasingly seeing companies opening up the technology. But the technology alone isn't really much use. We need access to data also. Sonia, can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about data for us?
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Cooper. I'm an Assistant General Counsel in the Open Innovation team at Microsoft, which is part of the Intellectual Property Group. As a patent attorney, I've supported Microsoft research in Cambridge, focusing on their AI development. I'm also a passionate advocate for open data and worked extensively on Microsoft's open data campaign. I think, as we all know, AI is a foundational technology. It has the capability to actually help us address some of society's most pressing challenges. It can help us be more productive. It can help companies and countries be more competitive. But I think as I think about AI openness, it's not just about open technologies. I think it's really about thinking about the broader factors that enable AI innovation and importantly, allow everyone to participate in AI development and AI use. And access to data is critical for AI development and also AI use if you're going to be able to meaningfully use AI. And what we've seen is a huge disparity in the access to data that companies, even countries, have. And so I think helping to address that disparity, enabling access to data, is really key to enabling AI innovation more broadly and that AI openness. And Laura, it was really interesting to hear about kind of how you're thinking about valuing essentially, the tooling that you're making available. And actually, I think what I've found is actually if you start to try to value the outcomes that you're driving rather than, I think typically I've seen it in the context of data, rather than the data itself or the software itself, I think that enables you then to have the right perspective, because often if you place the value at the wrong point, it can lead to just very different behaviours that you might see if you don't otherwise focus on the outcomes.
When have you seen that go well or badly?
go well or
Say that
bad.
again, I couldn't hear you. I don't know about
I'm
any
sorry.
of this.
I was just wondering if you've got, because that's very interesting, have you got examples of when people have done that value
Yes.
badly or well?
Yeah, in the context of data, I think, we've seen, I think when the Ordnance Survey maps released all of their data, and I think the government actually helped to enable that, I think the amount of applications that were then able to be built on that was, I think, then driving a different value for government in the amount of tax revenue potentially. And I think...
Probably similar with the open transport data.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, if we are to think about the outcomes that we want to drive and what incentives we want to drive around that, I think if you conversely look at actually what does it mean to actually place value on the specific data, it leads to data hoarding. And actually, you then lose sight of what the important thing is around the value of data. It's not the fact that you have data. I think I've heard it described as data hugging, which is, really not particularly useful. It's actually more about how you're using that data. Forget that that there's value in the data or trying to place value in the data. Think about the actual outcomes that you're achieving.
So also what we've seen over a number of years, specific to open source software, is a shift in how it was valued. So we saw the European Commission in 2021 do a massive report on the value of open source, looking at recreating the things that have been put into the open. And we saw Harvard do similar work, which got you to the millions of dollars, if you were going to go and replace and rebuild something. And last year we saw them shift. Now Open UK has been doing this kind of values-based research around open source software for 3 years. But Harvard did it for the first time last year, and we saw them talk about a value being generated of 8 trillion. But it's super hard to value the outputs of something that's free, which is one of the biggest challenges we face and something that we need to do a lot more work on. So I have questions that I was going to come to in the panel, but I've allowed you all to talk a little bit longer because we don't have Aarushi. So if you three are okay, I'm going to hop over to the floor for 10 minutes and then come back and pick up on those questions if that's okay. So the audience, I don't know whether you were expecting this or not, but we're quite happy to talk to you about anything really. Laura may have some restrictions from her past role, but if you want to ask questions around openness, stick your hand up and I will come to anybody in the room. I've got a couple here. Anybody got any questions they want to bring to the panel already? That's unusual. Oh, yep, gentleman over there. Can you say who you are and where you're from, please?
Yeah, sure. Francis Woodhouse, Chief Technology Architect at Smith Institute. Your comment about licensing open source models to the private sector, I was wondering, can you comment on the enforcement that would be necessary to make that private sector licensing reliable and achievable with public sector openness at the same time?
What do you mean by
I mean that if you're going to have license conditions that say you must pay X if you are private sector to use this open source software, then how do you enforce that?
I should probably answer this, I think.
Go for it.
Really, So I have worked in open source since 2008. My name's on the front of the book, Open Source Law, Policy and Practice. I'm supposed to know about licensing. What you're talking about in open source software terms would be called public or distributed source because it has a condition. And your enforcement is effectively the same as any other licensing enforcement. When you get to open source, it can't have those conditions. It cannot restrict the usage and it cannot restrict the person who uses it for any purpose. So it flips it away from that and you enter into what's really just a standard proprietary regime. When it comes to open source software, pure open source software, there are people who do enforcement work in that space and they generally are code-holding organizations or foundations who steward the software on behalf of engineering. I think there was a case in the US just last week that was, it was in Germany last week that was successful in enforcing that, and there's also been class actions in the US as well as individual cases. So there are routes to enforcement. It's not like it's a wilderness. I think the bigger challenge is understanding what it is you're giving and why you're doing that. So if you look at it from a more commercial and enterprise rather than public sector perspective, and you look at something like the Llama Community License, it has a restriction when you hit 7 million users, which means you go back to Meta for a commercial license. So if anybody is hugely successful on that software, then they get to a point that they have to go back and Meta wins because Meta gets a cut from it. We don't know what that cut would be. And that's sort of counterintuitive generally to the nature of open source, where this sort of open core or service type model will work around it. Does that give you what you probably...
Well, I mean, exactly. It's not... Many companies have this sort of problem where they have their code in the open, but there is a license requirement on it. It's very difficult to enforce. I don't think government's going to be looking to hire a band of experts going around and poking through code bases to try and sniff out whether there's a few lines of something in there. I don't think that would be a particularly good use of time. But I do think that, within the business ecosystem, largish companies have legal teams who are fairly careful to make sure that they're not sort of stealing IP. Yeah. So I think that, you could expect some revenue from that. And I certainly don't think we could stop somebody in China taking it off and using it. If we want to worry about that, then we're going to have to make sure that we keep the code completely closed. So that's just a design choice, really, isn't it?
And we wouldn't have an LLM that's cost 20% of what the standard has been historically if we didn't have China engaging and we didn't have DeepSeek bringing R1 to market. But we wouldn't have had that if they weren't able to use American technology and they weren't able to bring French technology in. One of the quite interesting things that happened at the Action Summit from an open source perspective is we saw more governance shifting away from law and regulation into tooling. And they launched something called Roost, R-O-O-S-T, and it's a set of open source governance tooling that comes from the big techs, which has been donated into an organisation with 30 million of funding. And Laura, earlier you mentioned public good. We also saw a 500 million foundation being set up by the French. Now, you've talked about the work we've done at 10 Digital, and the AI Safety Institute has also, last May, open sourced its Inspect evaluation platform. So the UK was super ahead in this space, but actually the French are now #1 in Europe when it comes to open source and openness and AI. Do we have any more questions? This lady here.
Everyone. My name is Sonia Cooper. I'm from Responsible AI UK. I was wondering, how do you help the public understand that it's to their benefit when data is being opened or open sourced, especially when the value is from opening that data for innovation or for the work to happen on top versus hoarding it or charging for that data?
Okay. And there's another lady here, I think, had a question, Ariel.
Hi there, Ariel Bennett from the Alan Turing Institute, Senior Researcher for Open Source Practices. I was wondering if the panel could comment on the EU policies that we're seeing, particularly the Germans setting up the Sovereign Tech Agency to explicitly support open source, and whether there would be a benefit in the UK taking a similar approach to really coordinate its support of open source beyond government as well.
Okay, and there was one more question I saw there. Right, so we'll take this gentleman's as well. We'll answer the three, and then we'll get to our final questions.
Yeah, hi, Khalil Adib, AI engineer at Firemines. I just have a few questions. I think she mentioned this as well, like about the data. So, like when we say open source models, I think most people refer to the weights, opening of the weights, but we don't, usually we don't see the actual data that is being used to train these models. And most of these data would be crowded from the internet, and then they have copyright license, so we don't, company, they don't take into consideration these data as well. And then one other question is I think I read the DeepSeek paper, but they didn't mention anything about the data that's being used to train, and then I think they mentioned that they installed other models, maybe ChatGPT. So what do we think about, so like a company can expose their APIs, and that they have license on that, but another company they can get like fully open source model, and then they install that model, like using prompting, and then they can use SFT to train that data, the model. So what do we think about this?
So thank you. So I'm going to come to you first, Sonia. Data, opening up the data. Any comments?
And convincing the public that it's a good thing. So I think one thing that is important is certainly fostering trust through trustworthy behaviour. And I think ensuring that data is handled appropriately has to be key to ensuring that the public, that actually being more open with data is a good thing. But from my perspective and what I've seen, it's actually encouraging a mindset shift towards how we think about data. Predominantly in the private sector, actually, because I think companies are starting to recognize that it is valuable for them as well to be more open with data. And I think going back to the point that I was making in relation to outcomes, thinking about the business benefits of being more open with data is actually something that we're seeing shifting behaviors in businesses' approaches to actually sharing more data, being more open with data. Because essentially no one has all of the data that they need to be able to derive some of these, insights that are now possible through data and analytics and AI. And I think recognizing that there is a huge opportunity if we change our way of thinking about data so that actually we're enabling more insights to be derived from more open approaches essentially to information. I think that's important. And so the outcomes essentially will speak for themselves, I think, but as we start to take a more open approach to data.
Let's go to, can I go to Alex first? He's sitting very patiently.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I just wanted to expand that slightly in terms of why do we want to gather data in the first place? And, in effect, it is to create better models, right? And so, folks like Meta and DeepSeek and Mistral, et cetera, have gone through the effort of, in effect, finding the resources to gather the data, to create these, exceptional models and put them in the hands of anybody. So, right, so what effectively we have now is a world which a few years ago you needed to have to create a giant research lab with the resources of big tech. And now you've moved from that lab to being able to run these models on your laptop, right? These latest generations of models with a reasonably powered developer laptop with a GPU, you can fine-tune and create your own applications on top of that. And going further than that, the fine-tunings that you do, whether that be on your own proprietary data or on other public data sets, those fine-tunings can then be lifted and shifted to the next generation of the model, because they're all built on the same transformer architecture and have similar APIs. So as the market evolves and as new models are developed, you don't have to throw away that investment that you've made so far. You can literally upgrade as you go along. And that's one of the really powerful things that we now have access to that really simply wasn't possible a few years ago.
Thank you. And I have been focused on questions from the room. We also have, I have to say, dozens of questions online. So I'm trying to read those, juggle what's being said. One or two people are getting a bit cross online that their questions aren't being asked. That's why I'm trying to read and get through them all at the same time. And there are an awful lot. Laura, do you want to just...
I'd love to come in on
yes.
that one, if you don't mind, just really quickly. I think we actually do a terrible job of communicating with the public about open data. And I think as a community of technologists, we're really bad at it. We're all wandering around talking about transformer architecture, terrifying, and people don't really like it. And I think that we really, as a community, should start working on the storytelling a lot more. Government needs to do that too. We do try and do it with the incubator. But people actively shy away from telling the stories that explain to people the value they're deriving. So we've got something called MedGuard, and when we go and talk about MedGuard, what we say to people is, did you realise, we're told by academics, that 22,000 people a year are killed by bad prescription profiles, and it costs the NHS about £1 billion. Fortunately, we think we've got a solution to that using your data and some AI that will save lives, and all that money that you can then use on cancer treatments. If you start from the problem, or exactly as you were saying earlier, if you can say to people, do you remember what it was like before we had open data for transport? Do you remember how hard it was to find out where the buses were, and now it's on your phone? That's the outcome that you drive by being much more open. But it's still something that in large parts of government people don't think about enough, or they will actively run away from. Being too open. So I think it's a really good question, and I actually think that we need to work as collectively much, much harder on it.
And this whole conversation has made me think about two things that politicians have said to me in the last few months when I've been talking to them about openness. And one was, what would I do for the mainstream in terms of education? And it's not just about openness. I think every child at the stage that somebody is going to hand them one of these needs to start to learn that they have a digital persona, that they have a digital personality, and it's not specific to AI, but it increasingly will be. And we need to be teaching them, where their parents might not be able to, what this means and what's happening to data as they put it online and how that's being harvested and gathered. But genuinely, we're going to have to be doing that to little children as they're learning to read and write. It's going to be a huge thing. And then Laura,
Amanda, we'd like to do that. People talk about children a lot. What about older people? There's this huge equality divide where people of retirement age could genuinely be benefited hugely by advances in AI. They could be made safer, much less susceptible to harm, have more money, have better access to care very, very quickly. And we don't focus on that demographic at all either.
And I think there's a second thing that a politician said to me recently, which takes me into one of the many online questions around copyright. They said to me that the creative sector is doing a really good job of telling the stories to show why copyright should be restricted in text and data mining. Now, think about that. If you are in the creative sector, your job is kind of to tell a story, whether it's a painting, a movie, a song. You are a storyteller by trade, and your industry is about telling stories. And what Laura, you just said there is that we need, as a tech sector, to get much better about telling these stories and demonstrating these benefits, whatever level of openness is engaged in that product that you're using. So also just going back to what we were discussing around openness and copyright and TDM, Sonia, I want to come to you. There's a few questions, a couple from a journalist at Diginomica, just so you're aware, around the copyright consultation and ripping up our creative industries. Do you feel able to comment on something around the response to the copyright consultation and TDM?
Yes, certainly I can
There's
talk
a lot
about
of different things to distill.
The copyright issue more broadly. I think as we think about reforms to copyright law, it's important that we consider what copyright is intended to protect and ensure that there are robust protections to support copyright in relation to the outputs that are created by AI, because you don't want AI to be outputting anything that is an infringement, that is used in an infringing way, and you don't want to weaken any protection that would be existing protection that is there for rights holders in relation to the use of what would be a copy of their work. I think what's important is to actually take a step back and actually think about the technical analysis that's involved when you're analysing data, and again, what copyright is intended to protect. If you look at the scope of copyright protection as it's set out in TRIPS, for example, it says that copyright is intended to protect the expression of an idea, but it's not intended to lock up the ideas, the facts, the information that is within a copyright work. That's really important because that enables knowledge to be developed from being able to read from something and then build on that. Ideas are something that you can protect through patent protection, but not through copyright protection. If you are technically analysing something, it's necessary to take a technical copy of something in order to extract the unprotected elements. And I think we need to be very careful not to say that copyright prevents us from making those technical copies, because essentially what you will end up doing is locking up the ideas, the knowledge in that information that was never intended to be protected by copyright.
So we do not have anywhere near long enough as a panel to talk to you about openness and AI. As an organisation, Open UK has an advisory board on AI openness, and these three wonderful speakers are part of it. We have a dozen leading experts from the UK on that. We have a number of different events that we're going to be speaking at, and in different panels and different keynotes and things as a group, individually. And we have a number of Open UK events if you really want to drill down more into this openness concept. Ariella will answer your question about Germany has a sovereign tech fund, which was initially given, I think it was 5 million, then it was up to 15 million, and now it's 500 million to invest in openness in Germany. And there have been proposals to do something similar in the UK. Well, Germany is way behind the UK when it comes to open source software, and way behind the UK and France when it comes to AI openness. We were the first country in the world where we had a public sector policy of open source first, and it's now 13 years old. The problem with it is the implementation is the difficult piece. And Open UK has been working with UKRI on that and looking at how we can build better open source and openness across UK public sector and looking at how that will apply over time in AI. Personally, I wouldn't encourage building a siloed standalone unit. I think what we need to do is focus on the way that government is moving forward, and then the UK we're seeing more and more integration. So I think what we want to be is part of GDS and the other organisations as they rise from the ashes later this year under Emily Middleton's steer, and we become part of that, is my advice. Panelists, I can take 30 seconds from each of you on your single ask for government in terms of UK and AI openness. I'll come to you first, Sonia, if that's okay.
Thanks, Amanda. 30 seconds. So I think government should be thinking about enabling better data sharing infrastructure, as well as thinking about how the National Data Library can support AI innovation. But again, I think, particularly as the government thinks about copyright reform, ensuring that data analysis isn't prevented through copyright law.
Alex.
Build strong partnerships with private sector, in particular startups and founders, as well as universities, to really try to nurture talent on the technical side and fast track the connection of that talent with people building companies and support them through that first phase to get to product market fit. Could be done through a variety of ways, whether that's accelerators, incubators, hackathons, providing incentives for organizations to take bigger risks through things like R&D tax credits, which are great to expand upon that kind of thing.
Okay, and Laura.
Well, what I want to see next and fully intend to make sure happens next is a really big international digital public goods program.
Yeah.
That's backed by multiple governments, tech companies, academia, etc. And part of that digital public goods program, I want to be really focusing on educating different sectors of the public, including sort of a degree of nudging so that people aren't left behind.
I think that's a great concluding point from the panel. From my perspective, I very much hope that we'll see continuing global collaboration cross-border in what this year is already proving to be quite a difficult time. But I think that innovation, that continued collaboration is the only way that we're really going to see the best innovation. Please, I will try and pick up on the questions that I've got on here. People online, I'm sorry we couldn't get to more than a few of them. And anybody in the audience that wants to follow up with us, please do. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.